Welcome to the third Joan Muysken Lecture in honor of Professor Emeritus at the School of Business and Economics, Joan Muysken. And the lecture will be delivered by Professor Bill Mitchell from the University of Newcastle, Australia. My name is Tom van Veen. I'm the chair of the Department of Economics, AE2 in our school, and I'm happy to introduce Bill shortly to you. Professor Bill Mitchell holds the chair of economics and is director of the Center of Full Employment and Equity, COFFEE as it is called, which is a research center at the University of Newcastle in Australia. And his research covers a wide variety of topics like labor, macroeconomics, spatial econometrics, regional development and labor economics, and financial economics. And most of his research involves applied econometric modeling. Bill has published widely in refereed academic journals, books, and regularly gives conferences and presentations abroad. Bill has an extensive consulting experience both in the public and in the private sector and has written a large number of commissioned reports. He is on the editorial board of the Economic and Labour Relations Review and the Australian Journal of Labour Economics and on the management committee of the ARC, which is the Australian Research Grant Committee, a research network in spatially integrated social science. Bill maintains also a high commitment to community activities. He has been regularly called to appear as an expert witness in industrial matters in the relevant state and federal tribunals and at various federal government inquiries, Senate and House representatives. Bill is also a regular commentator on labor markets and on labor relations in the national radio and press. And I must say the external impact of his work is evidenced in a number of ways. His seminal work on job guarantee schemes has attracted international attention and application and has directly informed and influenced the policy agenda of the New Zealand's major task force on jobs, influenced the Australian Local Governments Association and the Argentinian Head of Households program. They all endorse the job guarantee model as a desirable regional policy model. Well, Bill has become widely known for his work on the job guarantee schemes and his extensive analysis on unemployment. This topic has brought Bill to Maastricht in the early 1990s and has been the start of a long-lasting cooperation with Joan Muysken, and therefore we are also very proud that we have Bill to deliver this lecture. This cooperation, this long-lasting cooperation, has also made it possible that several members of the department have stayed in Newcastle. Ricardo Welters, who went to Newcastle and never came back, still is in Australia. Ruud Gerards, who always wants to go to Newcastle. Denis de Krombrugge has stayed in Newcastle, and myself, I've been in Newcastle also a couple of times for shorter and longer periods, and for which we are still very thankful for Bill to being our host. We have come to know Bill as an excellent economist, an original thinker, and a critic of mainstream macroeconomics. Long before the global financial crisis, Bill pointed already at severe macroeconomic imbalances in domestic economies and in the world economy. For example, he warned in particular for austerity policies that have caused increases in private debt, and we all know the consequences. Today, Bill will talk about his view on the European Monetary Union, and in particular on the design of the Union. The lecture is entitled The Eurozone, Groupthink and Denial on a Grand Scale, and is based on Bill's latest book, Eurozone Dystopia, that appeared at Edward Elgar in 2015. Is this the view of an Australian outsider? Not at all, I would say. Bill is as much an insider as an outsider. He knows Europe very well, and this makes his view, I think, the more interesting. Bill, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. Thank you all for coming out on this freezing cold night. About the weekend before last at home, on the Friday it was 39 degrees Celsius. That was mild compared to the next day, which was 41. And then the following day was about 45, so this is very cold. Celsius. I'm also feel privileged or honoured or whatever the word is in English, to be invited to deliver this lecture in not memory, because he's still with us, but in honour of Joan, and so Joan, that goes without saying. And I want to talk about this is my book, the most recent book. I've got another one coming out in September, but this one is specifically about the Eurozone. And this book was sort of a very difficult one to put together, because I think I actually read almost every official document from 1945 onwards. Now, that mightn't sound so great until you realise that until Britain gained accession in the early 70s, there were hardly any English language documents for official documents. So I could already, I was okay in French and Dutch, but I've now learned Italian and German as a consequence. But it was, quite a tricky thing, because when you want to make points about words and phrases, you have to make sure that you're getting it right, rather than the Google version of getting it right. So it was quite a difficult book to write. Now, here's the conclusion, so that you don't have to wait. The first conclusion is that the EMU was doomed from the start because of the way it was designed. The design features of the intrinsic design features of the monetary union make it dysfunctional. The second conclusion is that the best option 8 years ago is the same as the best option today and tomorrow, and that is for everybody to get together, the now 19 member states, and meet somewhere other than Brussels, and agree to have an orderly dissolution of the arrangement. An experiment that failed, and failed miserably. The next best option, given that that's not going to happen until Germany says it will, is that nations unilaterally exit. There's no question in my mind that Greece and Italy would be better off just exiting. And the fourth conclusion is that there are options that have been canvassed that would allow the euro to remain as the common currency. But I conclude that they are, while they're identifiable, they'll be impossible to implement. And they'll be impossible to implement for the same reasons that the design was flawed in the first place. And I'm talking here about a federal fiscal capacity, for example. So they're my conclusions. Let's go for the discussion. The book was subtitle was Groupthink and Denial on a Grand Scale, and for the life of me, I've never been able to understand why the Maastricht Treaty was signed, and I've long struggled with trying to understand why we accept the authority of what I call mainstream economists when they deliver outcomes that are clearly detrimental to human well-being. And I'll give a talk to the staff here tomorrow, border on malpractice. Never been able to understand. It's quite clear in civil society, if an engineer builds a bridge that falls down, they go to jail. I've never been able to work out why malpractice among my profession, which is rife, is rewarded with very hefty sinecures and high salaries. And so I was, to try to come to terms with that, I started to explore the social psychology literature, and this took me into this idea of groupthink, And this was identified early in the 60s by Irving Janis, who was an American social psychologist. And this is about the way groups learn pattern behaviour, and the way this pattern behaviour becomes a self-reinforcing self-deception that the community all goes along with, the community within the group. And there's definable characteristics, and I've listed some of them there. There's this avoidance of self-criticism. And so if you follow the economic debate in the literature, you'll be astounded that, there's virtually no ownership of the poor advice that's been given over the years. There's no ownership of it at all. And there's a repelling of any outside criticism. And any alternatives that are proposed are always met with hostility. And I remember back in the early 90s, I was on a panel in Florence, and there was European Commission people there, and at that stage I was very anti-Euro. And the logic that I was outlining is the same logic I'd outlined today about trying to bring together totally different economies in a common currency and not expect trouble, especially when for 30 or 40 years you hadn't been able to maintain stable currencies anyway under the fixed exchange rate arrangements. And I was met with extreme hostility. You're an outsider. What would you know? You don't live in Europe. And that's sort of an example of the way groupthink operates. And the other very common practice is to deny facts and revise history. And so if you follow the literature, you'll realise that there's been a major revision over the last decade about what happened during the 1930s, for example. The right wing of my profession are in total denial of what happened during the Great Depression and what ended the Great Depression. So it wasn't the deficit spending by governments prosecuting the Second World War, the early days of the Second World War, which that didn't end it, according to this revised history. And so groups that fall into this destructive pattern behaviour revise history to suit themselves. And if you think about the way the European Commission, the IMF and the OECD and other organisations have reacted through the crisis, it has all of the characteristics of groupthink. And that's why the crisis has gone on for so long. It's obvious what the problem is to anyone who's not trapped into the self-denial and the hostility to facts. So that's background to the way I sort of started to construct my understanding of all of this. This was a former central banker, governor or chairperson, president, I think you call them in the Netherlands. We're building it. This is his description of in the early days of what was going to happen with the common currency. We're building it on quicksand. And he was very right. The first part of this talk is going to be about history, because what I've found over the years, and I'm in Europe quite a lot, and I've got a lot of contacts in Europe, is that even well-educated Europeans have a limited, and this is the same in Australia, by the way, we don't know our own history, but there's a limited understanding of what led to all of this. And particularly the younger generation, because they didn't live through it, have virtually zero understanding of the evolution to the disaster that became the Maastricht Treaty. And what history tells us about Europe and about the widening membership of the community and what have you, is that nations with very different economic structures, think Germany and Greece, or even Germany and France, by the way. We don't have to be so diverse. Germany and France have got very different economic structures. And those, you overlay that then with a lack of cultural solidarity, and then you try to fix exchange rates between those entities, those geographic entities, and you'll have trouble. And the other important way that I understand the evolution of the Eurozone is that there had been a long struggle for integration from the end of the Second World War through to the 70s and even the late 70s without any success at all. The French and the Germans were never going to really be able to agree to a common currency. And what the game breaker was a change in French attitudes. And what changed the French attitude, as I'll explain, was the advent of Chicago-based monetarism in the economic profession. Because when Milton Friedman's monetarism started to surge through the academy first, and then penetrated out among central bankers, and the first central bankers that really got infested with monetarism were Bank of England central bankers. They were really the first to try monetary targeting in 1971. They abandoned it in 1972. No central bank after that should have ever tried it again, but as groupthink was spreading, everyone was becoming a monetarist. And it was the spread of monetarism through policy departments that changed was the game breaker. Because as I'll explain, in France, that altered the power relations in the French ministries. Previously it had been Jean Monnet's ministry in planning that was the dominant ministry, and the Ministry of Finance was weak in terms of influence of French direction under de Gaulle. But with monetarism, the planning ministry started to lose its clout, and the finance ministry became almost German in attitudes, prioritising inflation over planning and employment, for example. And that's what allowed Delors, who had become infested with monetarism, that's how he was able to broach the gap, the traditional Franco-German rivalry. Now, when you think back to the beginnings of all of this debate after the wreckage of the Second World War, Europe was in chaos, and the great visionaries, and I'm thinking of Robert Schuman and Jean Monnet and these type of integrationists, they didn't desire to build a integrated European economy into a straitjacket of austerity and hardship. That was the anathema to their vision. And their aim was, this so-called European project was a political project, basically to render Germany a citizen of the world rather than a Nazi attack machine. And so the whole European project was to try to end forever the martial tendencies of Germany and to bring them into a European dialogue without guns and gas centres, but as cooperative political entities. And of course the economic background of all of those discussions were Keynesian. In other words, the nation state was a powerful force that could maintain prosperity and full employment. But even if you start with the Treaty of Rome, you'll realise that the grand visions that Monet and Schuman had were already becoming compromised, because the bitterness after the war, particularly in France, was so great against the Germans and the Italians, who were sort of second-rate Germans to the French. That the Treaty of Rome was really quite a nasty document in terms of the anti-German bias in it. And that was, the French hadn't learnt from the Treaty of Versailles, basically. And so the Treaty of Rome was very biased towards France, and de Gaulle was only really willing to talk integration in as much as he thought at that stage, because Germany was in chaos and also in shame for what it had done, and were lying low and trying to think about industrial strength as their only way back towards some sort of rectitude. And the French thought that they had the European scene to themselves, and they would create intergovernmental relationships in as much as they could dominate them, and that France would become the dominant force. And it's very interesting if you really go through the history, you form the opinion, there's a lot of there's a lot of German bashing now, that it's the evil empire within the Eurozone. But they were reluctant partners. It was the French that thought that the integration would benefit them because of their exaggerated view of their own capacities. The other point to really understand is that the Europeans were more obsessed with fixed exchange rates, so tying their currencies together in agreed parities, than any other nation. And partly that arose because one of the first expressions of European cooperation under this sort of new idea was the Common Agricultural Policy. The first disastrous step that you Europeans took, because it required a very complex system of prices, and would have become totally unworkable with significant currency variability. And of course the French were all for the Common Agricultural Policy because they could see it as a way of getting Germany to subsidise their farmers. And Germany went along with it because they were both in shame but also wanted to have a capacity to expand markets for what they foresaw to be their growing industrial engine. So to them it was a chance to get some salvation back as some sort of sense of normality in a world that they had shocked and become pariahs. But they also had another view about that it was going to be a bigger market for their exports, and that's the way the Germans were thinking. So they were prepared to go along with the subsidy to the French rural lobby. But the only problem was that really locked the community, the growing integrated community, into fixed exchange rates. And the rest of the world were under a fixed exchange rate system in the post-war period called the Bretton Woods system. The European overlay on that was even more onerous in terms of allowable fluctuation ranges for the currencies around the agreed fixed parities. And the Bretton Woods system that we were all in was under pressure virtually from the beginning. It was proving to be difficult to maintain from the beginning, and that was because the nations with export strength were always seeing their exchange rate under upward pressure, and nations with weaker trading sectors, like France, were always under the pressure of having their exchange rates pushed down by the foreign exchange markets, where currencies are bought and sold to buy exports and financial assets. And so the problem for the external deficit countries was manifest because for them, their currency was always under downward pressure. Their central banks, under the fixed exchange rate agreement, had to go into the foreign exchange markets and withdraw their currency by buying up their own currency to put upward pressure on it back again. And they had to push their interest rates up to try to attract capital flows in, which would also put upward pressure on the exchange rate. And the upshot was that those deficit countries were always under political pressure because the domestic austerity that they had to inflict to maintain their exchange rate parity to the agreements created high unemployment and difficulty in stop-grow development and what have you. So the system was already under pressure worldwide, and it was particularly under pressure in Europe, particularly among what was the original five members. And it was particularly under pressure between France and Germany, the two big rivals. The early designs for the integration were conducted within this environment. The first big report was Pierre Verner's report in 1970, and there was no progress. He laid out from memory, an 8-year plan. It was to be fulfilled by the end of the 70s, from memory. There was no progress because the French started to get paranoid that the Germans would dominate. And the next major report was the McDougall report, which was begun in 75 and then released in 77. And Werner's report was sort of optimistic in a way. In the spirit of the times, it was an optimistic report. It had come out of the Basel deal in 69. But the McDougall report was much more pessimistic. But both of them emphasised. McDougall went out and studied other federations like Australia and Canada and the US, and got reached a very detailed understanding of how effective federations have to operate, with common currency. And they both emphasised in different ways, this fourth point here, that to be an effective economic and monetary union, you have to have a strong fiscal presence, that is a spending and taxation presence at the federal level, where the currency issuing is, the currency capacity is. That you can't leave those responsibilities for dealing with what an economist calls asymmetric spending shocks, which in English just means that one country gets hit with a downturn in business investment, or consumers become pessimistic, whatever, or they lose export markets, whatever. And both of them said that you couldn't leave that fiscal capacity at the sub-federal level, which in the European context was the member state level. In Australia, it's the state level. And they both also mentioned in different ways that federal fiscal capacity had to be aligned with the currency issuing capacity, but also had to be overseen and managed by a democratically elected institution like the European Parliament, not like the European Commission, and certainly not like the Finance Ministers subcommittee of the European Commission. And as I said, Verner was a bit optimistic, but McDougall was totally clear that at the stage of development of political and cultural and other developments within Europe, that there was really no way that committee concluded that the conditions that would be required for an effective monetary and economic union could be met. Quite clear. And at the time, the Danish central bank governor said this: "I'll begin to believe in European economic and monetary union when someone explains how you control 9 horses that are all running at different speeds within the same harness." I thought that was a great observation. Okay, and so I'll go through this part of it very quickly because the lesson is very simple. The Bretton Woods system that was the fixed exchange rate system for the world broke down in August 1971 when President Nixon suspended gold convertibility of the US dollar and floated the US dollar. At that stage, the agreement hadn't officially broken down, but effectively it officially broke down 2 years later, but it effectively broke down at that point. Against all the logic, except the need, the compromises on currency management that the Common Agricultural Policy enforced, against all other logic, Europe pressed on. The rest of the world floated our currencies. The floats came at different stages after the breakdown, but we all worked out that we had to float our currencies. Europe continued down the fixed exchange rate route. The first one was the serpent in the tunnel after the Basel Accord, 72. So this was a fixed exchange rate arrangement between the member states, and the tunnel was the allowable fluctuation that the currencies could move in. And they were pretty tight. The tunnel was pretty narrow, let me tell you. Now, it didn't take long, the snake escaped, and the tunnel was abandoned a year later in 1973, and that was when the US went off decided that was going to float unambiguously. And the so-called Smithsonian Agreement collapsed in 73. That was the agreement that tried to resurrect the Bretton Woods Agreement. Britain had already pulled out of the snake very quickly. France was in and out because its currency was going like a rubber band or bouncing ball, and the central bank just didn't have the foreign exchange reserves to stay in the agreed parities. And out of that mess, the Europeans then decided to go one step deeper into the mud, into the morass of dysfunction, and they created the EMS, the European Monetary System, in 1978. So instead of facing the facts that the snake and the tunnel had proved unambiguously that these nations within the community would be unable to maintain a fixed exchange rate system among them. They were too different in their external sectors and their cultural attitudes. They decided to go one step deeper into it. And this was the so-called myth of symmetrical intervention. It certainly collapsed. Yeah, that's symbolic. And basically the symmetrical intervention that was agreed on was that to make the EMS work, every central bank would behave symmetrically in defending the currency, the pairs of currencies. So, for example, France was always facing downward pressure against the mark. And under symmetrical intervention that they agreed to in theory, that meant that the German central bank, the Deutsche Bundesbank, had to sell marks into the foreign exchange market to put more supply in and push the price down. And the Bank of France had to buy francs and sell marks to push the price of the franc up. The franc up, yes. So, and it had to be symmetrical, because what they worked out under the snake was that without that symmetry, one central bank would soon run out of foreign exchange reserves. Anyway, it was all very nice in theory, but of course the Deutsche Bank reneged on the deal pretty quickly, because there were massive internal struggles between the German government and the Bundesbank at the time, and the Bundesbank quickly realised, and this is a group of individuals who have such a paranoid fear of inflation, it's almost unbelievable. And they soon worked out that symmetrical intervention, given their trading strength, would require them to flood the foreign exchange markets with Deutschmarks, which they believed would be inflationary in the domestic economy. That belief was erroneous, by the way, but that's what they believed. And so the Germans soon reneged on that and just refused to play ball. And well, that system collapsed in Black Wednesday, if you remember Black Wednesday, when the crisis in Britain with the pound and Norman Lamont, the Chancellor, out there, and it was a crazy time. But one of the other points that is not very well recalled by those who lived through it or understood by those who didn't was that really the only reason there was any stability in these type of currency arrangements were that the countries were running capital controls. So the governments and central banks were restricting currency movements across borders. Now, currency controls were wiped out by the Single Market Act in 1987 and phased out over the next 2 years. And once they were phased out, Italy and France's currencies went crazy again, and we got to Black Wednesday a couple of years later. It was no surprise. The only thing that giving any semblance of stability were the capital controls. Okay, moving right along. The lessons that were ignored 10 years later, that nations with very different economies and export strengths will always find it difficult tying their exchange rates together and to try to jointly prosper in the process. Nations such as Italy, France and Germany can never prosper jointly if their currencies are pegged. And the might of the German export machine and the uncooperative nature of the Deutsche Bank will always make sure of that. That's what those experiments over several decades in fixed exchange rates had taught us by the time people came to this town in the early 90s to design the next plank that the member states were going to walk off and drown from. And we're back to those horses. Remember the horses running at different speeds in the same harness? Well, what eventually allowed the 9 horses to be harnessed together and run at the same sort of speed, and we've increasingly learnt that slow, was not because the Franco-German rivalry really changed, and it wasn't a cultural shift, but it was because of a growing homogenisation in the economic debate, and that's the advent of monetarism. And with monetarism starting to sweep right through the policy-making departments and the central banks out from the academy, almost everybody at that time started to believe, and I say I didn't, but most people did, that self-regulating free markets, we now call it neoliberalism, self-regulating free markets would deliver the best outcome, that inflation control was a priority. We started to hear words of inflation first, and unemployment ceased to be a policy target and became a policy tool to discipline the inflation process. That process, those ideas permeated the whole policy debate. But within France, very importantly, it led to a major shift in power with the planning ministry that was de Gaulle and de Gaulle's baby, that lost influence to the finance ministry. And the finance ministry was full of monetarists, which made them really not very distinct from the way the Germans thought about the economy. There was a major shift in French thinking because of the composition of influence among their policy ministries. And of course, the first expression of that was the Raymond Barre plan in 1976, which was the sort of first expression of what we now call austerity and deregulation and privatisation. And the argument then is that really that allowed the so-called socialist Jacques Delors, who was in Mitterrand's socialist government and then went to the Commission, that allowed him to pursue the final act leading up to Maastricht, which was the Delors Report, 1989. And For those who know the Delors report, you'll know that he immediately abandoned all of the major insights from the Verner report and the McDougall report, which I mentioned before. And Delors was very cunning because he knew that he could con the French to agree to it by saying to them, you can keep your fiscal independence at the member state level. We won't have any big overriding fiscal authority challenging your sovereignty. You can keep it. And then he turned to the Germans on the other side of the table and whispered to them, yeah, but we'll make it so impossible that they won't be able to use it effectively anyway. So the Germans were happy with that. The French were happy because, you know, they were conned into this, if you recall, all this stuff about subsidiarity and, you know, the right level of responsibility pitched at the level where it matters. And at that point, the dysfunction of the Eurozone was defined. The failure to create a federal fiscal capacity was a terminal error. And to satisfy the Germans, remember the Stability and Growth Pact was didn't begin life as the Stability and Growth Pact. It began life as a German document called the Stability Pact. And the growth bit was only added to placate the French. And the so-called 3% rule, which we all have some, is that a scientific sort of derived rule? No. Mitterrand asked his so-called budget budget sort of specialist in the Ministry of Finance to come up with some sort of thing that would give him credibility in 1981. And the guy who was responsible for the 3% rule is now disclosed in the French press a few years ago that they just were one night ordered to come up with a number. So it was just, he said it was just a back of the envelope number that they could give to Mitterrand that made it look as though they were being disciplined, but didn't really matter much anyway because the deficit was around 3% at the time in France anyway. But it just made them look as though they had a rule. And at the time, Mitterrand was having problems with political credibility. And so this made them look sort of like tough, that they were doing something about the issue. And so that was the origins of the 3% rule. It's just made up. It has no economic meaning at all, really. And then, of course, text message from somewhere, sorry. And then, of course, we had the convergence fast through the 90s. And, much has been made of the Goldman Sachs manipulation of the Greek fiscal accounts. But the Germans did it too. They were redefining things that were and in the book I go into detail about the sort of way in which the Germans tried to manipulate their accounts to meet all of the convergence criteria. And it was quite obvious that they all cheated to meet them because they were impossible to meet. And there's an interesting thing that's suitable for this audience. André Sass reports of just before the Dutch government agreed to ratify the proposal, that there was a meeting between him and the cabinet of the Dutch government at the time. And he said he looked around and was listening to the discussion, and he realised that nobody really knew what they were letting themselves in for. And the head of government said to everybody, "It's quite obvious that we haven't really appreciated the full intent of what we've been agreeing to and being supporters of." And the finance minister at the time was Koch, and he said, "You better get your act together because we've got to agree on this in a couple of days," I think it was. And if you go back, those who lived through that time, the citizens didn't know what they were letting themselves in for. Denmark rejected it, and that's why they got a special deal. France nearly rejected it. And then, of course, the Treaty of Lisbon, the Lisbon process decided, well, we won't go through ratification processes at all. because they knew that it would be rejected. Okay. Then it all starts, and we have Germany understanding the system much better than anyone else, basically. And they realise in the past, the Deutsche Bundesbank were experts in manipulating the Deutschmark to benefit their export sector. And they quickly realised, obviously, that with the fixed exchange, effectively what was the one currency which imposed rigid exchange rates on every member state that signed up to go in, they quickly realised that all the adjustment would have to be domestic. All the trade imbalance adjustment would have to be domestic in terms of wages and costs, prices. And so, you know, they dragged out what the Volkswagen guy, Hartz, who later was sort of totally shamed in scandal, but he did his work before that, and the so-called Hartz reforms, the mini-job revolution and all the rest of it. And that was a deliberate act to suppress German costs, because they knew that they had to retain the export competitiveness of their industry so that they could outdo their partners. And of course, the problem with that, as we later learned, was that if you suppress your domestic wages growth and you suppress domestic demand, well, then your export surpluses, and you suppress domestic investment, then your export surpluses have to go somewhere, and that capital flooded into property market speculation in Ireland and Spain. That's later. Of course, the Stability and Growth Pact failed virtually immediately. 2003, where the two big offenders were France and Germany. And of course, then under pressure from Germany, using the manipulation of the sort of arcane voting system of the European Council, they got the rules modified. And at the time, the German finance minister came out and said, well, 3 doesn't mean 3.0, being that they couldn't get down to a deficit to satisfy the Stability and Growth Pact. It was crazy. Crisis was inevitable. In the 90s, there was a group of economists, including myself, that were writing academic papers predicting the crisis. It was only a matter of time, not if, because of the way in which private debt, with financial market deregulation and the growth of so-called financial engineering, it was only and a huge expansion of private sector debt, particularly speculative type debt. People were no longer just borrowing for homes, they were borrowing what was so-called margin debt to speculate in share markets, and they were rolling houses that they'd already bought into speculative packages under pressure from investment bankers and selling all these dodgy products. It was only a matter that a crisis would happen. And of course, at the time, the groupthink was so powerful, that the official response was, oh no, this is great, everybody's building wealth. What are you worried about all this debt for? It's backed by wealth. Well, share market wealth dissipates very quickly, and as we've seen in Spain, if you've been there recently, the ghost towns, so does housing values. And of course, the correct response to the crisis, once the American housing market collapsed and that spread throughout the world, was that every nation state should have been running quite large fiscal deficits. And that's because it was a balance sheet crisis, which is different to a normal recession. A normal recession is because business investment collapses, people get pessimistic, you have a big V down, and then governments stimulate the economy, investors get confident again, and you get a V back again. It's normally, they can be very deep Vs, but they're normally relatively short-lived events. But a balance sheet crisis is a different type, because that's sourced in the financial markets through a collapse of assets associated with the debt. And so what's got to happen there is not only does spending have to be maintained to get activity going again, but the balance sheet, precarious balance sheets have to be fixed. And fixing the precariousness of these balance sheets that were so loaded with dodgy debt, very high risk and very insecure debt, takes a decade or more. Takes a decade of suppressed non-government spending while they save their way out of their precarious state. And so we knew that the deficits had to be quite large and they had to be sustained for a very long time at elevated levels, maybe for 15 years. Of course, the response of the Troika was exactly the opposite. Was to, because initially what happened was the deficits went up in Europe, and if you look at GDP paths, they thought Europe was doing exactly what everyone else was doing. They had the downturn, it was quite deep initially, and then governments responded and the GDP started to grow again, everywhere. And for the nations that maintained those fiscal stimuluses, like the US, Britain, Australia, Japan, China, the growth kept going. It was relatively tepid growth, but it kept going. But as soon as Europe started to impose austerity, that short surge in growth recovery disappeared quickly. Okay. And, the IMF was telling the European Commission that if they imposed austerity, well then that would lead to expansion because the private sector would realise that the lower deficits would be less of a future tax obligation. This was the logic, it's crazy stuff. And that they'd start spending again. But everybody knew, who knew anything, and that excludes the IMF, that human psychology is that when unemployment's high and job losses risk is very high, households start saving, they don't spend. And when households are saving and not spending, business firms don't invest because they don't want productive capacity that they can't sell the stuff that's produced from it. It was just obvious that it was going to worsen the situation, not improve it. And of course, we've had the destruction of Greece. This is the IMF, by the way, and I'll only show you an example. Look down for unemployment, for example. This is the IMF forecast, This is the IMF forecast in 2010, 11, 12, 13. So the unemployment rate, see it? And then look what the actual outcome was. And look at the GDP forecasts. And these were forecasts that were used to justify their austerity packages built into the bailout plans. Now, if an engineer built a bridge with that much discrepancy, the bridge would fall down and they'd go to jail. Well, Greece did fall down like a bridge collapsing, but no one went to jail. The other thing that was very interesting was that the only reason the Eurozone continues to exist is because the European Central Bank violated the treaty. And it started violating the treaty in May 2010 when it introduced the so-called securities market program, which was effectively buying Spanish, Greek and Irish government debt because the bond market stopped funding those governments. And in 2012, they had another surge in bond spending to save Italy. And in effect, they were acting as a fiscal agent because the primary bond dealers who were buying the issue knew that next day they could go and sell it to the ECB at a profit. And so, in effect, even though the ECB was saying, oh, we're only buying the debt in the secondary market, we're not directly funding the governments, because that would be not allowed under the no bailout provision. They were bailing out the governments, and they continue to bail out the governments. Okay, so the last part of the talk, which I'll only spend 5 or 6 minutes on, maybe, is that these are the options. More of the same. So you've seen over the last 8 years a plethora of European Commission activity, and you just get sick of reading these new documents that Plan A, Plan B. There was an American TV series that still shows called Get Smart, if anyone knows it, and they're always Plan A and Plan B, and they're always catastrophes. And it's a spy drama, a comedy. But every one of these so-called new innovations that are going to resolve it have just been total disasters. The latest one being the banking union, which is not a union at all, because Germany wouldn't allow it. And so the point is that, yeah, you can go on as you are, and eventually it'll just fall apart because of the increased social instability. And the likely initial source is not probably going to be France, it'll probably be Italy. The second option is to create, as Verner and McDougall reports said, after studying well-functioned federations like my own country, Australia, and Canada, is that to create a true supranational, that is a federal fiscal capacity, like the Australian government, have a European government, match the responsibilities of that with the central bank so that they work together closely, as all treasuries and central banks have to work, and that's another issue, and marry that into the democratic process. And if you could do that, then the Eurozone would survive and everybody could be prosperous. And German citizens wouldn't care less about billions of dollars getting sent to Spain or Greece to help them achieve the same standard of living as the Germans. That's what a federation does. In Australia, we don't blink an eyelid when the federal government pumps billions of dollars into one region if there's been a natural disaster. In Australia, we wouldn't accept a divergence of standard of living between two states. This wouldn't be possible. That's the nature of a federation. And what I conclude in the book, and I think others are now concluding that as well, is that there really is no Europe at that level. Everybody talks about, Europe, the European project. But when it comes down to it, if you ask me where I come from, I'll say I'm an Australian. And I bet you if I ask any one of you where you're from, you won't say you're from Europe. Now, I might be from Victoria, and I might be from Melbourne, or I might be from Ashwood, going down in granularity. But I would never think like that. So in the sort of context of a functioning federation, there is no Europe. It's a myth. And you'll never be able to create that. The culture, we've seen the cultural antagonisms that have grown in the crisis between Greece and Germany, and reviving all of the old Second World War enmity. So that option theoretically would save the situation, but it won't work. It won't be possible to do. The third option, which is my preferred option and should be your preferred option, is for this orderly dissolution. And the reason an orderly dissolution is better than a unilateral exit is it allows a much more coherent process to be put in place to handle the tricky legal things about debt obligations, cross-border debt obligations that would arise. And so it would be so much better for everybody if it was recognised that this was an experiment. Okay, life is an experiment. Some things fail, some things don't. This has failed dramatically. And it's got virtually no hope of delivering sustained prosperity. That won't happen either. So the most realistic option, and I think this will become a forced option because of internal social instability and increased poverty rates. I mean, Greek poverty rates have risen by 40% in the last year. Greek suicide rates have risen by some ridiculous level. You can't get penicillin in the hospitals anymore. You've got to buy them on eBay if you've got the money. Import them and take them to the doctor yourself. Just the most basic things that define a sophisticated, advanced country are breaking down in the Eurozone. And so I think the most likely thing, and so the second preferred option, is unilateral exit. And there's absolutely no doubt in my mind, while the short-run costs would be high, they will never be as high as staying in the disaster. And, you know, in the book I go into chapter and verse, very great detail about how a country could exit. And I know that everyone says, oh, it would be virtually impossible to exit. How are they going to do it? Well, it's actually pretty easy to exit. There is international law in favour of exit, so-called lex monetae, the principle that's a convention of international law that a sovereign state has the right to denominate its liabilities in whatever currency it chooses. So Greece could tomorrow announce that all euro-denominated liabilities are now drachma liabilities, and nobody could do anything about it. And the force of that international convention is not lost on the Troika, because in the second bailout, the IMF forced the Greek government to accept the debt obligations that were legally drawn up in London because they were then not liabilities that were drafted under Greek law. And so lex monetae didn't apply, they knew that. And so, and as I said to someone this afternoon, a lot of people think that it would be how would you turn all the currency back on? Well, the legacy system is still there in the computer systems. And in 2012, I think it was, from memory, when it looked like Greece was going to be forced out, Bloomberg had an experiment one morning where they, with their trading systems, where they turned the drachma back on. And suddenly it appeared on all the foreign exchange trading screens for a few minutes, just to see. And I'm told that it's really just a computer switch, like a bit of software, that turns all the old currencies back on. It's not rocket science to... Lithuania has just turned her currency on. It's not rocket science to do it. And but the groupthink will tell you exactly the opposite. So I think I've spoken for long enough, and I'm going to say thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk so far. And we will now move into the Q&A. Does any one of you have a question? Maybe about the options?
I just might add that this is my blog. I write a daily blog, and it's got quite a lot of visitors each day, but you can track down a lot more of the detail of all of this by reading that.
Thanks for the presentation. Among the options you mentioned for dissolution of the euro, I was missing the possibility that we could split it in North and South, a Mediterranean euro versus a Northern European So you would have more homogeneous currency zones.
Who do you
would
include?
Culturally fit better.
Who are you including in the north? The question is, could you have a north-south currency union? Who are you including in the north?
I would say Benelux, Germany, Austria, Finland, and the critical point would be France.
You wouldn't include them?
For political correctness, you should have them in the north, but in economic sense, it could better be in the south.
It was quite interesting because when they were, there's documents that were sort of leaked from the German discussions in the late 80s, and the hypothesis was that we would make the convergent criteria so onerous that Italy wouldn't be allowed in. Of course, then the Germans realised that Belgium wouldn't be allowed in either under those conditions. And at one stage, the advisor to the Ministry of Finance said, whatever you think of Italy, we'd have to have it in because it was one of the founding states of the community and one of the 5 founding states. So, that bears on France too. And the point is that the lessons of history are quite clear that France and Germany cannot maintain stable currencies between themselves, given the disparate nature of their economies. And so France would be very badly served being in a currency union with Germany or Netherlands. Luxembourg's a strange thing anyway, so it's like a tax haven, isn't it now? Even though the current leader of the European Commission denies it, but it's another matter. So look, the point about currency unions are that if you've got significant homogeneity across your geographic space in terms of structure of economy, structure of costs, which means productivity, and a cultural similarity and tolerance, particularly if it's a mono-language. So here I'm thinking of the Australian states. Then you can have a currency union. But, there's been talk that Australia and New Zealand should have a common currency. But that would never be successful either because of the cultural differences between the two countries. There would be deep resentment with fiscal transfers between Canberra and Wellington. And so, you might, and if you do have a North currency union, it'll just quickly become a Deutschmark zone, just like the EMS was in the 70s and the 80s. And everybody else would have to play ball to the strength of the German economy. And playing ball to the strength of the German economy is that every other economy, perhaps excluding the Netherlands, but certainly France and certainly Finland, for example, would have to maintain permanent austerity to stop imports pushing the trading imbalances. So I don't even believe a northern currency zone would work very well, but certainly, why would you bother? Why not just float and restore currency sovereignty? I mean, what's not understood is that once you enter a monetary union, you start using a foreign currency. All the 19 member states in the Eurozone use a foreign currency. The last few slides I just didn't talk about because of time were the advantages of having your own currency. They're massive advantages relative to using a foreign currency. So I can't see any rationale for having any currency union anywhere. But I certainly don't think France and Germany could function effectively within a currency union. And I can't see that Italy is a strong exporting country. Spain and Greece aren't, particularly. Spain and Greece. Why? Portugal, neither. Their industries collapsed, so why? I'm very sceptical about currency unions across different language spaces and across different industrial structures. They don't work.
I don't know why you stop at the national borders, because on that type of argument, we should split Germany in east and west, and Belgium in north and south, and Italy in north and south.
Maybe you should.
There is absolutely no reason to stop at national borders.
There are reasons to stop at currency borders. And an effective currency border is determined by the nature of the geographic units within it. So at the moment, these political divisions you call national borders, and I can accept the terminology, they're political divisions. And in the case of Australia, we're lucky that we're an island, so it was pretty natural to make that a country. But I don't see any purpose for Wallonia to be in the same country as the Vlaams, the Flemish. Belgium would be better, the Flemish moving to the Netherlands and the Walloons moving to France. Economically. But culturally that won't happen. And that's the whole point. Belgium is a constructed sort of entity. And it's got flawed, what? No, they're not. They evolve through cultural acceptances. Belgium's unique in the sense that and you live there and I've been there, but I know it doesn't strike me as the East and the West get on very well. They do. And Catalonia will probably break away from Spain if Spain stays in the Eurozone. That's true. Andalusia wants to break away. So what? You stop at geographic aggregations that are culturally consistent and have economic structures that don't lead to persistent imbalances. And if you do have economic structures within geographic units that do lead to imbalances, then the cultural homogeneity has to be strong enough to allow a rich state to support a weak state without any bitterness. So Australia, New South Wales and Victoria, for example, support South Australia and Tasmania, which are very poor, which have no chance of supporting themselves really. But you go to Hobart in Tasmania and you go to Melbourne in Victoria, and the standard of living is the same. There's massive internal transfers through the Commonwealth Grants Commission. Vertical transfers from the rich, high-income states of Australia to the low-income states, so that everybody has the same standard of living, and none of us worry about that because that's a defined cultural boundary. That's where you stop.
My question is, it's about scale and functionality, and we see a global economy on one side, and the other side call for sustainability, and that's more helped by regional, geographic regional organization. And maybe we can leave the state and we start to make regions of 4 or 5 million people and Europe.
Well,
Europe. So the state is, that's a problem, the state.
If I understand your question...
On this moment.
Yeah, if I understand what you're saying, and excuse me if I haven't, the European project that Jean Monnet and Schuman started in the late 40s was an excellent project. And the development of a multilateral institutional framework for dealing with very large political and social problems is a sound development. And I can see that no individual country, for example, can handle climate change issues or the migration issues. To enforce human rights, we need multilateral arrangements so that we've got rule of law. And that's where the European project should have stopped. That's a perfectly reasonable reason and a very effective structure to deal with those big issues that no individual country can deal with. But to go to the next step and deprive the member states of their capacity to maintain full employment and to enforce youth unemployment of 60% so that, we've got youth in Greece that have never worked, they're now adults. What's their future? To go that next step was a step too far because that was not the most effective organising level for fiscal policy was at the member state level. And it was up to the political process to discipline that within the member state as a democratic institution. So I agree with you that there's a scale issue and certain issues are best dealt with at a European level. And that's what I think the European project initially, with different examples, because in those days they were trying to stop war. Now we've got to deal with migration and climate change and things like that. But it went too far. Should have never gone to the monetary union.
We have about 10 more minutes, so let's keep questions brief.
Your points you mentioned were exactly my question actually. Because the scale, you need a scale for certain problems. So Europe, there was a reason for Europe. And I find your talk a little bit pessimistic. And of course you should have your reasons, with all your respect, of course. With all my respect. But there is a reason for Europe that it happened. And it will continue in this place. If we break up now, it will be a big disaster. And then you can say to me, it's group thinking. It's not group thinking. It's about scale. It's about climate change. It's about defense. And what would happen if we had all our currencies, each country itself, in 2007? If we would have our own currency in 2007 in the Netherlands, we would blown away. And then my other point is, what do you see? Is economics, is that a science or is it an opinion? What you were telling, is that an opinion or is it a science?
The first point is that I think you're reflecting a view that's now very common and it's been promoted by the elites that the monetary union is Europe. And membership of the Eurozone is not membership of Europe. Greece will always be in Europe. France will always be in Europe. But you can leave the Eurozone and you're still in Europe. Denmark's not in the Eurozone, but it's still part of Europe. Of course, and in the previous answer I said that breaking the monetary union doesn't break up the European project. There's still a reason to have European cooperation at a political level. There's still a reason to have European institutions that can deal with those big issues. But that's quite a separate argument to having an oppressive monetary union that fails to deliver prosperity. And the second point I'd make is if you all had your own currencies in 2007, the huge export surpluses that Germany built up prior to that, which flooded the southern and Ireland economies with speculative investment capital, which fueled the property booms because of the one-size-fits-all interest rate from the ECB. You wouldn't have had that. The health of your economies going into the crisis would have been much, much different to what they were. Spain wouldn't have had the property boom, it wouldn't have had the construction boom. Germany wouldn't have had the capital to push and would have had to stimulate its own domestic demand or go into recession. Ireland wouldn't have had the property boom in leading up to the crisis. So when you say if you had have had your own currency, you would have crashed, that's not true. Well, look, economics is not a science.
Let's continue.
Economics doesn't have control groups. It can't be a science. Opinions stand as verified by facts. If your opinion is the Eurozone's a great idea, well then the facts don't tell us that.
I would like to know what is your opinion about the Eurobonds idea, like a path toward us to build up again European Union towards European fiscal union too.
I just couldn't pick up what you were saying. I apologise.
Eurobonds solution. Eurobonds. I don't know if the pronunciation.
Eurobonds. Okay. Yeah.
Thanks.
Sorry, I just couldn't hear. It was sort of distorted in the microphone. Well, first of all, on a pragmatic basis, the Germans will never allow for Eurobonds. That's fact. But the point about Eurobonds is as a standalone concept. They don't make any sense unless you embed them in a federal fiscal capacity. And then unless you embed that in a democratic institution to make the decisions about that, so that you're accountable to people on a regular basis through federal elections, then it doesn't make any sense to me for any discussions of Eurobonds. So on a conceptual level, it's the cart before the horse. The first debate you have to have is whether you will ever have a federal fiscal capacity, and the answer to that is no. But then on a pragmatic level, the Germans have already said you're not going to have Eurobonds. They're never going to take common responsibility for debt issued by other governments.
Well, I have a question which is a bit linked to that, I think, so it's also about bonds. You talk about countries leaving the Eurozone and you talk about Greece and France, and I would just wonder, I just assume that you take on a midterm to medium long-term view when thinking of countries leaving the Eurozone, but what would be the immediate consequence of, for example, Greece redenominating their debt in the drachma, which would obviously lead to yields going up, which would make the Greek reflation very difficult, I assume, because there's just no way that they can borrow money at their interest rates that they would have to pay at the moment.
I liked your use of the word obviously.
It's not
obvious to me. First of all, a lot of people confuse the issuing of a brand new currency when they're trying to work out what would happen. They confuse the issuing of a brand new currency with relaxing a peg on an existing currency or abandoning a currency board of a currency that's already trading in the foreign exchange markets. And so then they predict, as history tells us, when a currency goes off a peg, if they've got trade problems, it starts to depreciate quite quickly. And we've seen examples of that in Argentina in 2002. We've seen more recent examples in Iceland, for example. But issuing a new currency is a totally different dynamic because it doesn't exist within the foreign exchange markets. For a currency to depreciate, there's got to be an excess supply. For a new currency that's issued by the government, initially there's going to be an excess demand for it, as long as the government can enforce the tax obligations to create the demand for that currency. So I don't see, first of all, that, say Greece, you've used that example, that initially its currency is not going to depreciate much at all because people are going to struggle to get hold of it. That's the first point. The second point is the lex monetae says that they can, the principle says they can denominate it in whatever parity they like, including default completely. And so in terms of Argentina, which is an example I had personal dealings with, when they had their crisis in December 2001, they defaulted on all foreign currency denominated debt. Just said, we're not paying. That's what everybody said. And I've been at press conferences where that was stated. And sure, the First World Investment Bank said, we're never going to invest in your country again. Well, guess what? A whole lot of Chinese money went in there, a lot of Venezuelan money went in there, a lot of other money went in there. Because the Argentinian government stimulated domestic demand, they created an employment guarantee, and within 6 months they'd employed 700,000 people within this employment guarantee, which stabilised domestic demand and allowed growth to return. And foreign direct investment shifted in source, but didn't really go down. And guess what too? Within about 3 years, the investment bankers that said they'd never invest in Argentina were busily investing again, despite the fact that the Argentinian government had defaulted previously. And the reason why they invested again is because there was growth. And there was a press conference from the Minister of Finance of the Argentinian government in about 2005 from memory. And he was asked by the media, how do you explain the fact that 4 years ago you completely defaulted on all your foreign currency debt and now you're getting flooded with First World, that's the normal Wall Street investment bank funds. How do you explain that? And he said, what you've all misunderstood is that the investment bankers ultimately are not ideological. The IMF are ideological, the World Bank are ideology, the media's ideological, and they'll have this story that no one will ever invest there because they've defaulted. But the investment bankers are watching arbitrage opportunities every minute of every day with their computer algorithms and their market screens, and they go where their margin is. And so I think that history tells you a different story to the one you understand.
All right. I think with that one, we have used our question time to the utmost extent. And if you now have further questions, you can ask them during the after drinks. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much, Bill Mitchell and Tom.
Thank you.
Thank you.